Welcome to the politicalbetting.com Polling Matter Show. My name is Kieran Pedley. On this week's show, we'll be looking at the Lib Dem conference and whether the Lib Dems can fight back after a disastrous general election last year. But first, events across the pond. Next week sees the first presidential debate, and the stakes are very, very high. Recently, the polls have tightened to turn the Trump versus Clinton race into a genuine contest, as opposed to something that everyone previously thought Hillary Clinton was destined to win easily. So what should we be expecting from next week's debate? What does the current polling tell us? I'm joined this week by Leo Barassi of Noise of the Crowd. Leo, welcome.
Hi, Kieran.
And our regular guest and contributor, Matthew Chaddock from Labrooks Politics.
Hi, Kieran.
Hi. So guys, as usual, let's sort of take this as we normally do, and we'll each introduce a topic and discuss what we find. I'm going to start with my topic this week, which is the US presidential race. Certainly lots of interest in this. Now, I've been trying to get my head around some of the polls because, you know, you've got the head-to-head polling between the two candidates, and you've got the state-by-state polling, which we know is really, really important because that's where the contest is won and lost. But we've also got polling that includes other candidates in the race. Now, this is something that historically we don't pay too much attention to because fringe candidates are usually just that. They're on the fringes of the debate. But there is some evidence that this time it could be quite important. So if we look at a recent poll from NBC SurveyMonkey, we see that when you only ask voters about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, you have Donald Trump on 45 and Hillary Clinton on 50, and 6% other/don't know. Obviously, there's a bit of rounding going on there. When you specifically probe, though, for Gary Johnson and Jill Stein, we find that the numbers change quite dramatically. Donald Trump is on 40, Hillary Clinton on 45, so again a 5-point gap. But Gary Johnson is on 10%, and other/don't know on 6 again. So we see that probing Gary Johnson's name in opinion polls has a huge impact on the number of people that say they'll vote for a third-party candidate, which I guess is representative of the fact that Trump and Clinton aren't, you know, especially popular. Now, this poll is interesting because the gap between the two main candidates remains at 5 points regardless. Actually, this is quite unusual for this sort of poll. In a lot of other polls that we see, we actually see the gap between Clinton and Trump a little bit closer when you probe for Gary Johnson specifically. I mean, Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, does do reasonably well as well. And this sort of reflects that there are doubts on the side of some millennials who supported Bernie Sanders and whether they want to support Hillary Clinton, having backed him. But also, just again, as I said, a lot of distrust of both major candidates. Now, when you look at it on a state-by-state basis, it gets even more interesting because, as we know, that's where the race is won and lost. And I suppose if you look at Gary Johnson's vote share in individual states, it's often the difference, or more than the difference, between the gap between Trump and Clinton. One very major example would be Florida, where, depending on which poll you read, it's either neck and neck or Clinton's anywhere up to maybe 5 points clear at the moment. But Gary Johnson's constantly above that and often around the sort of double digits mark, maybe a bit shy of that, but maybe sort of 10 or 11%. So it's very clear to me that in crucial swing states such as Florida, where Gary Johnson's vote goes, and indeed, to an extent in that state, Jill Stein's too, is going to impact upon who actually ends up becoming the next president of the United States. So we look ahead to the debates next week. What does this mean for that? Ultimately, I would argue that when you have Trump and Clinton on stage, there is an argument to say that that's going to concentrate people's minds on the choice between the two candidates. And ultimately, you might expect the vote share for people like Gary Johnson to decline as a consequence. But Leo, I'll get your thoughts on this. There's also an argument, I suppose, that people look at both candidates on the stage side by side and say, I was right, I don't like either of them, actually I am going to take that third-party candidate more seriously. I mean, what do you think about some of this this polling and specifically around the debates next week?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, the debate is unlikely, I would say, to sway that many people who are particularly strong partisans of either of the leading candidates. But the camps know that, and they're doing a lot of expectation management about what they need to do and what the point of the debate is. But I think, as you've touched on it, particularly from Clinton's perspective, the real purpose of this debate is, as ever, exposing or trying to emphasise the risk that Trump would be. So, I mean, I would expect, is going to very much want to at least, sort of do neutrally herself, but above all to show people who, in a forced choice race, would prefer her to Trump, that the stakes really matter, and that it's a close race, and a third-party vote is essentially a wasted vote.
I mean, Matt, what's your perspective on the debate? Supposedly about 100 million people are going to watch them or thereabouts. So a huge event, and a huge opportunity for both candidates. But I was seeing some polling recently that suggested that Americans think Hillary Clinton is going to be the best debater and is likely to win the debate. So maybe Donald Trump has the benefit of low expectations going into it.
Yeah, that's definitely true. The bar's a lot lower for him. I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is that these things generally don't make much difference. I mean, maybe you can go back to 1980 when Reagan beat Carter. That seemed to do him a big favour there. So overall, I would expect the betting market to probably overreact to whatever happens in the debates. Ultimately, it probably won't change many people's minds, as Leo was saying. But I also agree with Leo that, the thing Clinton wants to do is make this election as much about whether Trump's fit to be president or not as possible. So, yeah, I agree. I think most of what she'll be doing is pointing out his flaws, his lack of experience, his temperament and so on. So, and if she can rile him up, that's all the better for her. Although, Trump didn't do too badly in most of the primary debates. He's quite good at bluffing his way through situations where he obviously doesn't know anything about the subject on hand. So I expect he'll do okay.
I mean, I wrote a piece for the political betting website this week looking at the impact of the recent sort of terrorist attacks in New York and New Jersey. It's an interesting debate, isn't it? Because usually the conventional wisdom is that if it's a sort of national security election, that the Republicans will end up benefiting from that. Then I suppose on this occasion, you could argue the opposite. You could argue that Hillary Clinton being seen as a safe pair of hands and Donald Trump being seen as something of a live wire means that it's going to benefit Hillary Clinton. My perspective is it probably does end up benefiting Hillary Clinton in the end, but that's by no means for definite. I mean, Matt, what's your perspective on what sort of impact recent events might have?
Yeah, I mean, just thinking back to some other events, the Paris attacks, the nightclub attack in Orlando, I think it was. I don't think that gave Trump much of a bounce in the polls, or at least it didn't last very long. So I wouldn't necessarily expect what's happened recently to make that much difference. You're right, of course, on the one hand, Trump is saying, let's seal the borders and keep these people out. Of course, that must appeal to some people, but on the other hand, you've got the issue of whether he's qualified to be commander-in-chief in the first place, whereas obviously Hillary Clinton being Secretary of State for 4 years, knowing a lot more about world affairs than Trump will ever do. That's going to play into her hands. I would imagine overall it won't make much difference.
Leo, what do you think? I mean, ultimately, it does seem that, a bit like Brexit almost in a way, that the campaign is being fought on Donald Trump's terms, on the issues that he ultimately advocates?
So I think that's true, but because we've got this underlying thing that it's such a weird election that the two candidates are both so immensely unpopular, there's this strange dynamic where the longer a candidate or the more a candidate is in the media over a period of time, generally the worse they do in the polls. And so that's why we've got this really strange dynamic where both of them are trying to focus it on the other person rather than on themselves. So I'm just not sure that the historical analogy of Republicans do better when it's a national security election necessarily works here, because if it's a national security election, then that emphasises Trump and it emphasises lots of his particularly strong views. And those are views that, well, they kind of cut both ways, because, okay, it's fairly obvious that a lot of Democrats are going to be reacting to them and thinking, actually, and going back to our point about third-party supporters, maybe this is the thing that turns them off. But on the other hand, these are, a bit like the Brexit analogy, these are things that energise the base. And perhaps, just perhaps, this is one of those times where lots of people who are not normally very engaged in politics, a bit like Brexit, are motivated to turn up because there's such an unusual thing on the table.
The celebrity of Trump, almost.
Yeah, exactly. So, to be honest, I feel like it's an argument you could make both ways, and I'm not sure anyone could realistically put their finger on what's going to happen.
We'll have to wait and see. I mean, certainly high stakes next Monday. I mean, Matt, looking at the numbers and the money, I guess, I mean, we were talking earlier about the fact that it seems like people are expecting Trump to do much better than they originally did, and his chances seem to be much better than they were. That seems to be reflected in forecasting like 538 and the like, but is that being reflected in the money as well?
Yeah, we can't stop taking money on Trump, and our odds aren't very generous. We're actively trying to get out of the way, because I can foresee us having a multi-million-pound liability on him come November the 8th, the way things are going. So we're decreasing the odds to try and discourage people from betting, but we can't stop them. And it's noticeable, isn't it, that some of the forecasting models and some of the other betting markets have some really very different estimations of Trump's chances of winning.
Let's put numbers to that for those listening in. So you've got, I believe, his odds at 40%.
Yeah.
Right? So to compare that to 538, they've got 44% probability of Trump winning, so quite similar. Otherwise, we've got Predict It on, is it 38, Betfair 31, New York Times, is that?
Yeah, so they've got, New York
25,
Times have got their own
25,
statistical model, which is just way, way different from 538's model, and they're both really just essentially looking at the polls, so that's pretty incredible. And, just in terms of the world of betting markets that I operate in, we're almost the best price in the world on Clinton. We're bigger than Betfair, and normally that would create an arbitrage situation which would close up very quickly. It hasn't happened because we can't take enough money on Clinton. So it's really odd the way the markets are working right now.
So just to be clear on that, are you saying that people can essentially make a guaranteed profit?
Yeah, right now you can back Clinton with Ladbrokes, you can lay it with Betfair, and you can leave yourself a small little edge whatever happens. Now, partly it's because...
That sound you can hear is politicalbetting.com commenters opening tabs in their browsers.
I mean, partly it's because it's 7 weeks away, so it is a very small edge, and not a lot of people want to leave all their money locked up for 7 weeks. If this was the day of the event, then no doubt that market inefficiency would close up. But it's odd to me. And I think also partly to do with the demographic of people who have Ladbrokes accounts and bet with Ladbrokes and go into our shops. Very different from the kind of people who use platforms like Betfair, and those people may have very different views of the world and how things are going to work out here.
I want to come back to the different forecasting models, Leo. It is notable that New York Times have a 25% chance of Trump winning, and 538 have a 44%. I'm not 100% sure which of their models that is, but I mean, I know that it's above 40 at the moment on 538. Obviously, different models are different, but what does this tell us about forecasting? Because I must admit, I've been a bit of a forecasting cynic since Brexit, because I remember being there on the night and sort of following some of that, and about 3 a.m, all the forecasts and whatnot, particularly the betting odds, just swapped round and said, "Oh, FYI, Leave's going to win now," which is like, well, thanks very much for that. Well, we kind of established that. I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, Matt can, and I'm sure will defend himself, but it's important to maintain the distinction between the betting markets and the forecasting odds. That they're trying to do different things. I mean, I think. Nate Silver was taking to Twitter, as they say, earlier today, defending the fact that they are something of an outlier, or at least more pro-Trump in terms of their model at the moment than many others. And his argument is essentially, look at the polls. We're the ones making the fewest assumptions about other things that may or may not be going on. And look, the polls are so close now that it's the people who are saying, "Oh no, it's still very much Clinton's race," who are the ones who are making the assumptions. So there are clearly differences in them that they argue about.
I mean, I think there is an argument that we overdo the comparison between Brexit and Trump, although there are obvious parallels there. But there's one thing I would say is that, for any Americans listening, is that there was a tendency during the EU referendum, even when the polls were going Leave's way, for everyone to say, particularly in the commentariat, and on the show, we'll admit, to say, "Oh, actually, but we all know it's really going to go back towards Remain's side as we get closer. People are risk averse, etc." And yet we tended to ignore some of the other factors, which we now know must have been telling, on the fact that immigration was the number one issue facing Brits. This kind of scepticism almost that on the economic message wasn't quite as cut and dry as we might have thought, or at least David Cameron was trying to portray. So if you just purely followed the polling numbers, there was a mixed story there, even if the headline figure did tend to favour Remain. There are similarities here and there, aren't there?
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, if you follow the numbers, it's a close race.
Well, we put our spin on the numbers at the time. We thought, a lot of us thought that it would close towards the risk-averse argument, and that the undecideds would swing towards the status quo, which didn't massively happen. I mean, the other thing we did, which I don't think is happening in America, and so is a difference, is there was a decision amongst the the people who follow polls to broadly pay more attention to phone polls rather than online polls. And there was a bit of an analysis to back that up. But even then, the analysis was disputed. But I remember sitting in a panel discussion at a conference talking about it. And at the time, the phone polls had about 8-point Remain lead, and the online polls were neck and neck. And basically, the discussion was, OK, so Remain are going to win. What's going to happen afterwards? And, you know, there was a brief mention of, should we worry about the online polls? And sort of, no, we don't need to. But I don't think that's happening here. I think the quality of American polls and the rig that they're subjected to is still a bit ahead of UK polls. So
there's no reason to think that they're wrong, is there? There's no general election a year ago that was wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And there isn't this modal difference that there was in the UK in American polls. So it's not like people looking at polls are forced to make a choice between two quite different sets of data.
Let's move on. I want to get to the Lib Dems, but Matt, I'm interested in one of these bets that you sent me earlier on the Labyrinth site called Clinton's firewall. And I'm going to describe it, and you're going to tell me if I'm right
okay,
or wrong. Go for it. It's a tricky one to get right. So Clinton's firewall. So a list of states, and so we start with Texas, for example, being the first one, and you have to basically look at the list and decide which one on the list Hillary Clinton is actually going to win. So, for example, let's take the first 5 in order. Texas is at 20-1, Montana's at 16-1, Georgia's at 6-1, Arizona's at 8-1, Iowa's at 9-2. So, if I put money on Georgia, let's say, which is third in that list, I win if Hillary doesn't win any of the previous states but wins Georgia. Is that?
Yes, you're trying to find the top one on our list which he will actually win. The list is ordered with states which we think are a bit more difficult for her to win near the top, like Texas. And states should be very easy for her to win down the bottom, and the question is how far down the list will you have to go to find a state she wins. And all the money since we released this yesterday, I think it was, has been on New Hampshire, which was 12-1 I think when we started. You got 8-1 on the graphic, actually 6-1 now. More people have backed it. But we had this market in previous presidential elections. We had something similar in the UK general election. It's quite good fun, right, for us polling nerds to try and work out what's going to happen. I mean, my view, shall I give you what I think might happen here?
What I was going to do is I will go through the list, and then we'll do a quick rapid fire thing. I'm going to name a state, and then you guys have to both say yes or no as to whether you think Clinton will win it. So let's see how we get on. I'll give my view afterwards, after I've seen all the choices, and I get to, it's my show, I get to do that. Right, so Texas.
No.
No.
Montana.
No.
No.
Georgia.
No, though a couple of months ago I'd have said yes.
Yeah, that seems like the first plausible one, but at the moment you'd have to say no.
Okay, so you get 6-1 on Georgia. Arizona.
No.
No, she'd have to recover quite a bit to win there.
Okay. Iowa.
So I think yes.
Iowa, interesting. What makes you say that?
I'm still clutching to the straw that I've mentioned on a previous episode, which is that I think that for completely understandable reasons, the polls aren't factoring in her superior organisation compared with Trump's. I mean, polls can't really be doing that. And I think that's going to be worth a couple of points. I think that where we are now is after a really bad spell for her that is probably not going to be repeated, post-pneumonia, post-basket of deplorables. So I think even before the ground game stuff, her numbers are going to tick up a bit, but that might not happen.
Matt, Iowa.
Trump seems to be ahead there most of the time. I'll say no.
I would go with that on the basis of there's quite a lot of white Christian voters in Iowa, and that's the Christian thing. Not sure whether Trump's got that locked down, but sort of angry white men, I think perhaps his constituency. Ohio.
That's pretty close. I think that's almost favourite on our list, right? I think that's very plausible. I'm not saying, I don't know if it's a great bet, but I think she'll probably, if I had to guess now, I think she'll probably win it, even though Trump's marginal favourite there.
7-2. Okay, so Leo stops at Iowa and Matt stops at Ohio. It's a very difficult one. I'm going to say North Carolina, actually, which is the next one on the list at 12-1. Trump's been polling very well in Ohio. He's a good sort of 5 points ahead at the moment. Now, it could be that the whole thing sways back the way it was going in the summer, in which case Arizona and Georgia are back in play. I just wonder if North Carolina, which from memory is quite close, depending on which polls you look at, Gary Johnson possibly doing quite well there. Yeah, I just wonder whether some of that sort of Obama support, if they can get it out on the day, might be key there. But do check that one out, listeners and viewers. That's an interesting one to go down the list and to pick which state you think that Clinton will win. Certainly a different angle to some of the betting. Let's move on to the Lib Dems, though. Leo, your topic this week. Hashtag Lib Dem fightback. How's it going?
So I think there's a couple of straws in the wind that are fairly encouraging for the Lib Dems. I mean, the first is for politics watchers. They might have started to notice that Lib Dems are beginning to have a bit of a series of good results in local councils. So there's a graphic up on screen for people watching, which has them having won 14 council by-elections since May.
Gains.
Okay, so those are gains, and that's pretty much the only one to have gained. The Greens have won. Everyone else has been losing. The other thing is from a YouGov poll last month, which asked people where they see the parties and where they put themselves. 7-point scale from very left of centre to very right of centre. What I found really interesting about this was 70% of those who gave a preference put themselves in the middle 3 boxes, which is slightly left of centre through to slightly right of centre. And then in terms of the parties, 37% put Labour there, 40% put Tories there, 21% UKIP there, 78% put Lib Dems there. So far and away, the Lib Dems are seen as being in the same place as people see themselves politically. So there's a sort of sweet spot politically that they're in. So it sort of feels there's a lot that's encouraging. But to be honest, I think that they've got actually more major problems than they've got good things going on at the moment. And I think that they've got a fundamental brand problem that they have to work past first. So, I mean, in the polling averages, the horse race, they're still pretty much where they were after the election. They're on the sort of 8-ish% mark. Another YouGov poll from this month asked people whether they'd consider voting for various parties, and only 22% said that they'd consider voting Lib Dem. 66% said that they wouldn't, which is really bad. I mean, no one ever gets all of the full percentage of people who say that they're going to vote for them, who say that they'd consider voting for them. So that 22%, that's very, very much a ceiling that they're unlikely to get to. So I'm thinking, how do they get past that? And I think that they've got 2 real problems in particular for how they get past it. The first is they've got to define themselves. They've got to make clear what they stand for in a way that cuts through beyond people who are really interested in politics. And I sort of feel you need a shorthand that people can say, oh yeah, this is them, this is what they're about. I think that's a lot easier when you're a protest party of the left than when you're trying to position yourself in the centre ground. So, 15 years ago or so, they could, or 10 years ago, they could say they had Iraq, they had tuition fees. They were very much a sort of a protest party and to the left of Labour. Now that space is taken, they can't do that. Somehow they need to get known for modernisation, for competence, for openness. That's a lot harder to do with sort of interesting, eye-catching stuff. I mean, they're going for the EU. I'm not sure that is cutting through yet, that people care about it enough. And then the other problem that they've got that is sort of in the same issue is I'm also just not sure that they've got the MPs, the voters, the party staff who really want them to be in that space. So for the last 20 years or so, they've been very much a party to the left of Labour in terms of public perceptions. Do they really have the will to be essentially a Blairite party, which is where the space is, a party very much seen as the centre ground? Perhaps they do, but I mean, to use a possibly slightly stretched analogy, it feels a bit like where I reckon Man United are going to go under Mourinho. It's like you've got a team that was kind of used to being an attacking team. You've got a fan base that wants to be an attacking team. And now they've got a manager that wants to make them quite boring and go for 1-0s and 0-0s. Mm-hmm. Is that really... I mean, if you do that, you can win the league. But you've got to have a lot of people wanting you to do it before you can.
I suppose there's a wider question about whether Tim Farron is Jose Mourinho quality as well. A couple of comments on that. I want to look at this poll about Tim Farron, because I think that obviously the leader is quite important here in terms of setting the direction that they go in and ultimately persuading people to vote Lib Dem. There's a poll by YouGov recently which looked at all voters, current Lib Dem voters, and people that formerly voted Lib Dem and now don't, or say they won't at least. And the killer finding is basically the question asks, do you think Tim Farron is doing well or badly as leader of the Lib Dem? It's a pretty basic question. 65% of voters don't know. I mean, it's Tim who? And this isn't going to be easy to cut through because ultimately the Lib Dems don't have the same number of questions at PMQs, if that even matters. They don't have the same sort of short money or the same sort of natural right to be heard as that they used to. If you look at current Lib Dem supporters, yeah, he's really popular. Sort of 50% think he's doing well, 18% badly, but even a third of current Lib Dem voters don't know. And then when you look at former Lib Dem voters, 47% don't know as well. So it really is a case of him struggling to cut through. I have this theory, which might sound a bit mad, but I'll go with it anyway, is that I think the Lib Dems would be better off with Nick Clegg as their leader still. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I doubt he has the sort of desire to go back into that role. And there's very obvious reasons why he might get hammered in that role, you know, and the Lib Dems would think, no, we need to move on. The reason I say that, though, is because ultimately he does have the profile for good or bad. And, you know, I've seen more of him on TV in the last week, or at least I've remembered it more, talking about his books and things and, you know, what his views on Brexit are than I can remember of seeing of Tim Farron. And I just wonder if in this world where Theresa May is the Prime Minister and Jeremy Corbyn, we presume, is the Labour leader, if Nick Clegg's in the middle of that, I don't know, it feels instinctive to me that he could do quite well. But I don't anticipate that happening, so I suppose it's maybe for the birds. Matt, I'll bring you in at this juncture. I mean, from what Leo's saying, it's quite difficult for the Lib Dems to sort of cut through now. I mean, what's your perspective on where they currently sit in British politics?
Well, just thinking about this 65% figure of people who have no idea either who Tim Farron is or whether he's doing well or not, I guess that's not that surprising, right? I mean, we've had a year since he's been leader where we've had non-stop talk about the problems of the Labour Party, the referendum and UKIP, the change of Prime Minister. You're right, he doesn't get any questions at PMQ, he doesn't always get questions at PMQs now. I guess it's not that surprising that people don't know who he is or what he's doing because they have been fairly irrelevant over the last year, and perhaps it's a really good sign that despite that, when there are actual elections, by-elections, when people are then given some information about the Liberal Democrats because they like sending out leaflets, etc., they're doing really well, right? So maybe that's a good sign that when the national discussion comes back to the Liberal Democrats as being a possible vehicle for your vote, and let's face it, there must be lots of, I'll use the technical term, wishy-washy centre-left people out there who don't like Jeremy Corbyn very much, who should be attracted to the Liberal Democrat message. So, you know, I think it's incredible to me that they're still on 8% nationally, but I look at the by-election results they've had and think, you know what, I think there is a lot of space there for them to do a lot better.
I mean, Leo, one of the things that we were talking about before the general election was, well, the Lib Dem vote share nationally, as Matt brings up, isn't too important because ultimately it's about what they do locally. It almost feels like what they could do with is a very strategically well-placed by-election, which they maybe one in the southwest that they were able to. I'm not sure what the majorities are like down there. I think they're reasonably solid for the Tories, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, it's interesting. But I mean, one of the problems is again, it comes back to where their voters are. That they do well in student towns. Well, you've got to think that Corbyn is going to start picking up support quite well in student towns as well. And I think Tim Farron would have been a great leader for the Lib Dems if Liz Kendall had been elected Labour leader, but I think I slightly disagree with the suggestion that there's a bunch of wishy-washy centre-left voters who would have voted Labour but don't like Corbyn. So I sort of feel, speaking for the wishy-washy, many of them will be Corbyn, and how many are left, I'm just not sure. I sort of feel, the coalition are the slightly more hard-nosed ex-lefties or lefties who, actually really quite likes Tony Blair. And I suppose what they need is to have people in focus groups saying, yeah, they're sort of, they're now the sensible party. They're a bit like Labour were a few years ago.
Mm. And how you achieve that's obviously the million-dollar question. Speaking of by-elections, as I was a moment ago, Matt, you've been taking some money on the Whitney by-election, haven't you?
Yeah, it's only a month away now. When this first came up, I thought this looks like the most boring non-betting event of all time, this by-election, because the Tories have obviously got a ginormous majority here.
Very sad-looking David Cameron,
yeah.
for people watching.
and I think the Liberal Democrats, I think we put them in 100 to 1 or maybe 50 to 1 when we first priced it up. And some people who I regard as quite sensible, who make money betting, have been backing the Liberal Democrats to actually win this seat, however implausible that may seem.
Maybe you'll have to reassess how sensible you think they are.
Yeah. I mean, it would be a massive shock. I think they got 6 or 7% of the general election. But when you start thinking about it, I mean, a lot of the Tory vote in this constituency, well, at least some of it would have been because the Prime Minister happened to be the candidate, and once they picked a anonymous local councillor, which looks like is the way they're going to go, then that probably drops their vote a bit. It was actually an area which was pro-Remain in the referendum, so there's some possibilities there for the Liberal Democrats. So, you know, we've got some betting there on who'll come second, which looks a bit more competitive, and people again have backed the Liberal Democrats there. I've backed myself to finish second, but I believe Labour have selected the guy who fought the general election for them, and someone on Twitter was telling me today that he's...
Goldberg.
Was that?
I think so, in Whitney. Might be wrong.
I could be wrong about that, but anyway, somebody was telling me that the candidate they do have has a reasonably positive local profile, so perhaps that will allow Labour to at least hang on to second. We were talking earlier, wouldn't we, about what the effect would be of Labour dropping to third or maybe even fourth here would be, and I think that would be a pretty big blow for Corbyn if they couldn't hang on to second place here.
Leah, do you think that's likely? I mean, I guess one of the characteristics of Corbyn's leadership seems to be, in my mind, that although his electoral performances haven't been great, they've never been the disaster that people have predicted them to be.
Well, apart from the by-election performance, sorry, the local council by-election performances, yeah, I mean, yeah, I would very much defer to Matt. I think it seems entirely possible that the Lib Dems might come to second. I mean, you know, this is a seat that the Tories still won in 97 before the MP defected to Labour. You know, it seems to me a race that the Lib Dems should be looking to target, and for Labour it's almost only downside. They're not going to win. You know, the only question is how do they avoid it looking really embarrassing.
Well, that's all we've got time for this week's politicalbetting.com Polling Matters show. Big thanks to my guests Matthew Shaddick and Leo Barassi. Join us next week when we've got a bumper show and we're looking at the outcome of the Labour leadership election. Everyone assumes Jeremy Corbyn will hang on, of course, but what happens next? We'll also be looking at the fallout from the first presidential debate on Monday, where Hillary Clinton takes on Donald Trump.